I'm from Zen Protocol. Zen is a blockchain focused on finance. But before I get into that, I want to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, in order to justify what we're doing, the logic behind it, I want to give an overview of the history of basically ownership and property. Then I'm going to talk about why Zen makes sense, how Zen provides the solutions for this, and some of the technical problems and solutions that we've encountered. So, the story of basically property. If you think about it, physical assets, they're inherently easy to assert ownership over and to transfer. If I'm holding this and I give it to you, I no longer have it, so it's easy to transfer it, and if I'm holding it, obviously I own it. But with digital assets, that's not much of the case. Essentially, if I had digital money, before we're thinking about Bitcoin, if I give it to you, how do you know that I no longer have it? It wouldn't be scarce. How do I transfer it to you? It's also a problem. So what we've done is we've had banks and brokers and trusted third parties essentially always holding the ledger for us. And what they do is we've ended up being in this world where we don't hold any of our assets and we can't move any of our assets without third-party permission. But after the internet came along, what you had is you had the cypherpunks, and what they wanted to do is they said, we want internet money for an internet era. So what they did is they built the way forward for Bitcoin by using cryptography in order to essentially, assert ownership over assets. But the thing is that when, let's say, if I can assert ownership over some piece of property and create a signature over it, I could send that same asset both to Alice and Bob at the same time. Thus, we encounter the double spend problem. And the solution to this problem was using a trusted server, which would basically sign off on every transaction and basically order the transactions for us. But then came along Bitcoin, and it changed that. It removed the need for a trusted server and replaced that with a decentralized group of people. And this decentralized group basically created a decentralized timestamp server known as a blockchain. And these people would compete to order transactions. And that was a big innovation here. After that, well, we had Bitcoin, but the thing about Bitcoin is you can only move one sort of asset, Bitcoins, and you can move them under a restrictive set of conditions. I can send a Bitcoin to one person, to a group of people, or I can, let's say, lock a Bitcoin in time. But people wanted to utilize the blockchain for more than that. You had, for example, colored coins, which came along and said, let's use the Bitcoin's blockchain to move any sort of asset. And you had Mastercoin that said, well, let's increase the sort of transfer conditions that we have. Not just a few simple conditions. But those weren't enough. And then you had Ethereum come along. And Ethereum was essentially motivated by wanting to break free of the restrictions of what color coins and Mastercoin had previously. So what they did is they created this virtual machine that allowed you to do any sort of computation. And because you can do anything, you can also get rid of any sort of condition, but it wasn't well designed necessarily for moving across assets. It was built for any sort of decentralized application. So what we look at, what is Zen? Zen is essentially the next logical step. We went from one asset to multiple assets to multiple conditions, but yet restrictive. And what we're saying is we want to be able to move any asset under any condition. And we want to use this in order to create financial instruments in a decentralized manner without any third party. So our blockchain is built from two specific objects, essentially. We have smart contracts and tokens. Now, smart contracts are a lot more similar. They're not what you necessarily think of normally, some sort of decentralized application of virtual machine. You can think of them as lockboxes. It's a lot more similar to Bitcoin script, where essentially you can lock assets, you can lock tokens into a contract, and then you can unlock the tokens out of that contract if the logic that's been encoded into the contract is valid, if it executes. The next thing we have is tokens. So if you think about tokens, that word may be used too much, but essentially what that is in our system we have first-class tokens. We have support for multiple tokens. If you look at other systems like Bitcoin, you have support for one asset. If you look at things like Ethereum, you still kind of have support for one asset, and you have ERC-20 contracts, which emulate a token but aren't necessarily a token, as you would think of it, in that you can't pay, let's say, transaction fees with it, and you can't own those tokens cryptographically. They're just a balance in a contract. With us, basically, it's much easier to deal with tokens. You could use one token to lock as collateral in another contract and issue a token which holds another token in reserve very easily. Now, the third piece that you need for this puzzle to work is essentially you need oracles. You need a mechanism when you encode these conditions of who gets what under what conditions. It's very important that we can have access to real-world data. Now, what's cool about our Oracle solution is because we're only focused on financial data, it's very easy to know what people are going to be interested, right? They're going to be interested in stock market data. And because we know exactly what data they're going to be interested in, what we can do is we can aggregate that data together, create a Merkle root out of it, which you may be familiar from Bitcoin, and commit that Merkle root to the chain. Then later on, when you want to, let's say, know the price of one specific asset, it's very easy to just prove that a certain leaf, let's say a certain stock was included in the Merkle root, and put that proof on the chain, and therefore you can know what the price of any stock is easily. So to go over this in example, let's say Alice wants to sell Bob a contract, an option on Apple. So essentially, Alice says, Bob, I'm going to give you the right to pay you $1 for every dollar that Apple goes above $150. Now, in the normal world, Alice and Bob would basically need a trusted third party to facilitate this transaction because Alice and Bob can't trust each other. But with us, basically, Alice encodes this logic into a contract. And then basically whatever will be in that contract will, let's say, pay out to Bob if Apple goes up above 150 or pay to Alice if it goes below. Now, what Alice is going to do is she's going to put collateral in that contract. So Bob knows that if the contract ends in his favor, he'll get something out of it. And then he feels free to pay the premium, to pay the insurance policy. He pays the $5, and then the contract will issue him a call option token. Now, let's say the oracles on a continuous basis commit to these Merkle roots and insert the state of the, whatever, the stock market into the blockchain. And let's say time goes by and Alice and Bob have an argument. They can't agree that Apple went up and that Alice owes, let's say Apple went to 160, but they can't agree that Alice won't give Bob his $10. So what Bob can do is he can take his call option token, he can pay the oracle to get a proof, and the oracle will provide him a proof, which then with the token and that proof he submits to the contract, and then the contract will basically give him $10. And this logic isn't just limited to simple call options. Any sort of logic that you can encode, you can create any sort of derivative you want backed by any sort of other asset very, very easily. So what are some of the special things that allow us to do this? Well, the first is our language. So we have a cutting-edge technology that basically allows you to do formal verification in our blockchain. And out of that, you get two things. The first thing is you can calculate resource bounds. So what does that mean? It means that just like in Bitcoin, where you know what transaction fee you should pay, the exact same way Zen works. If you take this versus, let's say, a virtual machine paradigm where you have to have gas because you can't determine how much computational resources it will take a contract to execute, that basically results in having to move to a virtual machine that can, measure the cost, et cetera, and move away from the classic UTXO design. But in our case, because we know how much a contract will cost, yet that contract can still be very flexible and have things like recursion in it, we can stay into a much more conventional design. So that's what we get the first property out of being able to prove stuff. The second property we get out of being able to prove stuff is we can prove correctness. We can prove certain properties about contracts. For example, we can prove that a contract doesn't have bugs in it. We can prove that a contract, if I, let's say, send a token to a contract, that contract will pay out to me 100 tokens. We can prove that if the price of Apple goes above $150, that contract will pay money to me. What this means is, you have to think about it. Let's say we move to this era where essentially people rather trust contracts than banks. Well, that would never work if there's this risk that you lose money. If the risk of losing money in a contract is greater than the risk of your bank not paying you your funds, then no one's going to use it. So it's very important that people feel they're safe. A second nice thing that we have is the way that we connect into Bitcoin. Ever since basically this whole industry has started, people have treated Bitcoin different ways. Some of the examples I mentioned earlier, like Colored Coins and Mastercoin, kind of rode on top of Bitcoin. You had things like Namecoin that were merge mined with Bitcoin. And you had altcoins that totally had nothing to do with Bitcoin. Now what we want to do is we want to have two goals. On one hand, we want to basically maintain Bitcoin's dominance as digital gold. We don't want to compete with Bitcoin as another altcoin on a monetary basis, but on the other hand, we don't want to be restricted by Bitcoin's restrictions, nor do we want to impose any unnecessary burden on the Bitcoin blockchain. So what we do is we basically run in parallel to Bitcoin. So every block, what's going to happen is that our Zen miners are going to take the state of Bitcoin and commit a hash of that into the Zen blockchain. What it allows is it allows contracts in Zen to operate on Bitcoin transactions. For example, if I write you a call option, then I can say you can pay me the premium on that call option in Bitcoin. And if I don't pay what I owe you, you can go and activate a contract on Zen and forfeit my collateral. Or on the other hand, I can prove that I paid you back what I owe you in Bitcoin. And if you falsely claim that I didn't pay you, I can prove that I did in Bitcoin. Another thing that you could do, for example, is right now, crowd sales seem to be a hot thing. Why just, go to another platform? You can just as easily, have a contract that says, if I receive a Bitcoin, I'll issue you a token on Zen. So that's one of our interesting properties. Another interesting property is multi-hash mining. So if you saw what happened in the past, basically past year or 2, 3 years in Bitcoin, is you had this situation of where essentially miners, the incentive mechanism that Satoshi constructed was no longer valid. Satoshi was under the assumption that essentially there's going to be a roughly equilibrium between people who have a stake in Bitcoin and hash power in Bitcoin. But what happened is because of ASICs, this diverged. And essentially you had a small group who controlled the majority of hash power. What this resulted is rather than resolving conflicts as Satoshi envisioned on a hash power vote, people weren't willing to accept that, and we had the whole Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash fork thing going on. Now, what we're basically saying is, why did this happen? The miners could act however they wanted because you had this this threat that if the only way that the users could hurt the miners was by basically hurting themselves very badly. And what we're saying is, we wrote a paper on this. This doesn't have to happen. You could have a situation where if you had, let's say, multiple hash functions being used, where let's say you have SHA-2 like in Bitcoin and let's say script like in Litecoin, you could have these competing. And if the users aren't happy with one set of miners, well, then they could go and they could get rid of those miners simply by voting. So without basically screwing up their own blockchain, they can financially harm, let's say, miners that they want to penalize. So right now we're in the stage that we have basically a proof of concept testnet. I invite you guys to download it and play with it at demo.zenprotocol.com. I invite you guys to come meet us at our booth. We have Ash and Nathan, who are experts in formal verification, who would love to talk to you. I'd love to talk to you guys about the Oracle mechanisms and our Bitcoin integration, and generally go into depth about what we're doing technologically. Essentially, please visit us at zenprotocol.com and hope to see you later in the conference. Thank you very much.